The challenge you often hear in church or about church is we focus on scriptures that are thousands of years old. And people say, well, okay, that's really interesting from a historical point of view, or that's good theological information, but how does that relate to me? How does what happened 3,200 years ago at a place called Rephidim affect my life today? So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to talk about the reading from Exodus. And to do that, I want to give you a little bit of context first. It's a pretty familiar story, the Exodus from Egypt. But we have to go over it just to lead us to where we want to be today. So last week we talked about Abraham and the promise that God made to Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation. The Hebrews are his descendants, so they are the core of this nation that Abraham was promised. Only the problem is the core of this nation that Abraham was promised has been living in captivity in Egypt for the last 400 years. For 400 years they have lived under the oppression of Pharaoh. And God finally said, my people are suffering. So I want to send someone to bring them out. And he sent Moses. Moses was an unlikely leader. He had been a Hebrew. He had then, by a combination of circumstances, been adopted into the Pharaoh's own family. And he had been somewhat influential as an Egyptian, and then he murdered someone. And he had to flee to Midian. And there, as far as Moses knew, he was going to live out his life as a fugitive shepherd. Only that wasn't the plan God had for Moses. One day, as Moses was out tending sheep, God came to him, called to him from the burning bush. And God said, "Hey, Moses, I know you're busy with the sheep and all, but I got a job for you. I want you to go to Egypt and lead the Hebrews to freedom." And Moses, when he hears this, his first response is, no, actually. Thank you for the offer, God, but I really don't want to do that. That's not my jam. And God continued to press him, and Moses kept finding reasons. I don't speak well. I have a stutter. I have a speech impediment, so I can't do it. And God says, fine, have your brother Aaron talk, but you be the leader. And then Moses finds other reasons. And for every reason he comes up with not to do what God wants him to do, God finds a reason that he should do it. And finally, Moses accepts the assignment from God. He goes back to Egypt. And he begins a campaign to liberate the Hebrew people. And after first appealing to the goodness of Pharaoh's heart, spoiler alert, there was no goodness in Pharaoh's heart. After appealing to that and getting shot down, Moses and God started a campaign that slowly ratcheted up the pressure with the idea that at some point Pharaoh would break and would allow the Hebrew people to leave. And he did this through a series of what are called plagues. And as many of them started, Moses would be the one kind of directing the action, and he would have his staff with him, his shepherd's staff. And as each event got progressively more and more intense, Pharaoh responded by ratcheting up the pressure on the slaves. Until finally that very last plague came, which was going to be the death of every firstborn, human and animal, in the kingdom of Egypt. That became the Passover holiday, which Jews still celebrate today, in which the angel of death, the spirit of death, was encouraged to pass over the houses of the Hebrew slaves. And that plague worked. Such a horrendous thing to have happen, the Pharaoh finally said, "Right, just go. Get out. Just leave." And the Hebrew people packed up and left. They took whatever they could carry. They took some gold and silver from their neighbors, and they left. And as they left, in the backs of their minds, they were thinking, this is going to go bad. Pharaoh is still going to come after us at some point. So they did not take the conventional route out of Egypt. It would have been a trade route that kind of skirted along the shore of the Mediterranean to Canaan, to Promised Land. They chose not to take that route. Instead, they crossed the border into the territory we now call Sinai, which was controlled by Egypt, but it was unpopulated wilderness. And they crossed the border by going across or through either the Red Sea, which is what we traditionally translate the words as, or the Reed Sea, which is what the Hebrew words actually say. And the discussion today is not what that event actually was. What we do know from the Bible, several different accounts in the book of Exodus, which is interesting in itself. There's at least 3 versions of this story. The Pharaoh's army does come after them, and it gets swallowed up and drowned and decimated. And the Hebrew people are now free. They've crossed the border into the Sinai, and they live happily ever after, right? If you're familiar with the Bible, you know that that is rarely the ending. So after they've been in the Sinai Peninsula for a while, the Hebrew people kind of wander around. It's a trackless area. They eventually begin to notice that there aren't really many drive-ins around. There's no restaurants. There's nothing to eat. And the Hebrew people turn to Moses and they say, "Moses, there's no McDonald's, no Pizza Hut, no Chick-fil-A. What the heck? There's not anything out here to eat. Why did you bring us here? Moses, why did you bring us here only to starve to death? What's the point?" We could have been back home in Egypt where we were slaves, but at least we knew where our next meal was coming from. Why did you bring us here to die? And the complaints went on and on and on. And eventually Moses had had enough, and he went to see God, and he explained to God what the concerns were. And God said, all right, tell you what. In the morning, I will provide something that they can eat as bread. And in the evening, I will provide meat for them. Will that satisfy them? Or do they really need Uber Eats out here? And Moses said, no, I think that'll work. And he went back and he told the people what was going to happen, and they all just said, sure, we're all going to die. Never mind. But sure enough, the next day, as the Hebrew people woke up, they saw this white stuff on the ground. And they picked it up, and they were able to use this to make bread. It's come to be known by us as manna. The Hebrew term is manha, which literally means, and I've said this before, but it literally means, what is this? We don't know what this is. And then in the evenings, when they came back to camp, they found their camp covered by quail in such density that they were easy to catch, easy to prepare, and so they had their meat. And with full bellies, the Hebrew people were content. They said, all right, I guess maybe God is looking out for us. Moses, that stuff we said before, never mind. We get it now. And so they continued to travel. They traveled on into the southern part of Sinai, a place known as the Wilderness of Sin. And in this case, that's a place name. It has nothing to do with the concept of sin as we know it. So they are wandering around in the Wilderness of Sin, which is dry. Really, really dry. And they start to notice that. They get up in the morning, they eat their manna, they come back at night, they eat their meat. But there is nothing to drink. And of course, the Hebrew people turn to Moses and they say, Moses, we're dying of thirst out here. There is nothing to drink. Why did you bring us here? Why did you bring us into this desolate wilderness to die? Were there just not enough graves to bury us in Egypt, so you brought us out here? Great plan, because we're just going to die in the desert here and the vultures will pick our bones clean. And eventually, after there were enough complaints, Moses once again turned to God. And he said, God, you hear him, right? Food's not enough. The food you provide to them daily is not enough. They're thirsty. God says, okay, I get it. So tell you what. Take your staff, that big shepherd staff that you've used before. And I want you to go and gather the leaders together and take them to this rock. That rock, right over there. Bring them there. And when everybody is gathered, I want you to take your staff and just whack the bejeebers out of that rock. Okay, that's not what he said. He said, take your staff and strike the rock once. And Moses probably had his own doubts. But he did what God said. And he gathered the leaders together, and he took his staff, and he hit the rock. And from the rock, pure, clean water began to flow. Cool, clear water flowed from the rock. And it was enough to slake the thirst of every Hebrew there. God had provided them with living water. And they were happy again. And they were sustained again by the miraculous love of God. And this is a story that gets kind of told and retold and repeated because over the course of years in the wilderness, the people will periodically complain, and God will periodically remind them that God is the source of their sustenance. And eventually, over the course of 20 years, the Hebrew people learned to trust in God. And they finally come to the promised land that God said would be theirs. And they enter into Canaan. That's the story in a nutshell. Big nutshell, but that's the story. How does that relate to us? I couldn't help but think this week that the uncertainty, the threat that the Hebrew people were feeling has to be kind of familiar to us. Because we too are living in uncertain times. The fact that I'm here today recording this message in an empty sanctuary says something about the uniqueness of these days. And yet, the lesson from Scripture is plain. Trust in God. Whatever is going on in your life, whatever your needs are, whatever your fears are, trust in God. And that trust, that faith will sustain you. That is the promise of God. It's not a magical promise that everything's going to work out exactly the way you want it. It's not a magical promise that all of a sudden things will be back to what we think of as normal. But it is a promise that with the strength of God behind us, we can weather any storm. All we need, the only central thing that we need to have is faith. Faith in God as our sustainer. And faith in Jesus Christ as our Redeemer. And if we have that, we can live as faithful children of God. And more importantly, in these times, we can live as disciples of Jesus Christ. And when I say disciple, I just don't mean a follower. I don't mean a student. I don't mean somebody who believes in Jesus Christ. I mean somebody who is living the lessons of Jesus. Somebody who is taking what Jesus said to heart and doing it. We live in uncertain times. We are sustained by faith, but those around us, some of them at least, what do they have? They may not have that faith that sustains them. And they may be facing the same troubles we are, or worse. So what does faith, what does discipleship mean in that situation? It means that as a disciple of Jesus Christ, we will do what we can to help our neighbors and our friends and our community. As disciples of Jesus Christ, we will even do what seems unlikely, because we are sustained by the love of God and the power of Jesus Christ in our lives. So I encourage you, in these uncertain times, as we sort out how we're going to continue to do church here, as we sort out what it's going to look like for the next few weeks, I encourage you to reach out to those around you. And I realize the irony there. You have to reach out, but you also have to keep your social distance. But reach out. Find out. Do you need help? Do you need help? Is there something I can do for you? Do you need me to go pick up food? Do you need me to do this? What do you need? How can I help? And as followers of Jesus Christ, as disciples, we can grow the love of Jesus in our community. Have faith. Trust in God. And trust in Jesus Christ. And live out the faith you have for those around you. We'll get through this. We can count on that.